Molt bé, comencem a l'últim acte acadèmic d'aquest primer Congrés Català de Gestió Clínica i Sanitària, amb aquesta conferència especial que li hem encarregat a Pim de Morree. It's for me a pleasure to present Pim de Morree, founder and partner of Corporate Rebels, the inspiring revolution that started, as far as I know, in a beer garden in La Barceloneta 7 years ago. At least you mention it in your book. Well, in this conversation with Joost Minnaar, your colleague, you made the decision to leave your promising careers in your big companies and embrace an idea, to look for companies based on employees' trust and implication. As you know, we have been following your revolution, and we are interested in understanding what are the keys that could help us to change our bureaucratic organizations. Pim de Morree, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation.
Thank you very much. Buenas tardes. Viví en Barcelona durante 6 meses en 2011, pero mi español no es suficiente para hacer una presentación completa en español. Por supuesto, y creo que es más importante, es suficiente para pedir unas cervezas. But the rest will be in English, unfortunately. Luckily, there is translation, so I'm very happy to be able to share with you some of the main things that we have learned over the past 7 years on how you can reinvent the way organizations work. And it indeed started, as Jordi already mentioned, here in Barcelona. We have been, Joost and myself, both been living in Barcelona for some time. But after our studies, we started to work for companies where we could do exactly the thing that we had studied for, which, by the way, is something totally different than what we are doing today. Myself, I studied industrial engineering, and I started to work for a company where I could do exactly that. And Joost, my colleague and co-founder of Corporate Rebels, he studied nanotechnology and started to work for a big German company in Barcelona. And we worked for about 3 years in these organizations, and we learned that even though we loved the content of the job, we hated the way the company and the work was structured. And over a period of 3 years, we became highly frustrated with the way that these organizations worked. So we decided to quit our jobs. Back in 2015, it indeed started with a conversation in a beer garden in Barceloneta. And of course, always the best ideas arise over a nice beer. That was also the case for Corporate Rebels. We first shared our frustration about our current work experiences. And we said that we were so frustrated by the manager who was telling us how we should be doing our job, the bureaucracy, the rules and the policies that were getting in the way of doing the thing we love to do. And we complained for a couple of minutes to each other, and then we said, well, instead of complaining, what can we actually do about it? How can we make sure that our work becomes more fun? And we came up with this idea of visiting some of the world's most progressive organizations we could find. Companies that had completely reinvented how they worked, that ditched the hierarchy, the bureaucracy, and instead found a way of organizing work to actually motivate people to a very high extent. And then the idea evolved into Corporate Rebels. And in January 2016, we quit our jobs to start looking for pioneers across the world to understand how to make work more fun. So that was the very first idea. Back then, it was not more than an idea. We had no business model. We had no way how we were going to make this a sustainable thing. But we had the belief that it was interesting for ourselves and for more people around the world to find a way to make work more fun. And we did a bit of research after we started into how big the problem of a lack of motivation in today's workplaces actually is. I'm going to share some of the data, and I'm going to tell you it is pretty painful. So if you look at some of the stuff that's being researched when it comes to engagement or motivation in the workplace, you can see that currently the way many organizations work is painfully broken. For example, if you look at engagement in the workplace, this study shows you that just 15% of the world's population is truly engaged at work. Just 15%. Those are the people that are truly passionate about their work and their work environment. 67% of the people is disengaged. So they come into their workplace, do what they're being told, but are not truly passionate about their work or their work environment. And then another interesting and quite painful group of people, 18% is actively disengaged at work. So they dislike their work and their work environment to such an extent that they start sabotaging the workplace. And this is painful, right? That people dislike their work so much that they start sabotaging the work that others or that the organization is trying to do. And you can imagine the effect it has on the success of these businesses as well. But unfortunately, there's more. A lot of people suffer from burnout symptoms in the workplace. For example, headaches when they have to go into work, or too much stress that they have to call in sick because they simply experience too much stress in their workplaces. And maybe an even more painful one, 40% of employees feel that their job makes no useful contribution to society. 40% of people. That means that a lot of people are spending their time at work not feeling that they are contributing to anything meaningful for society. So quite some painful statistics. And I'm going to promise you that the rest of the presentation will be less depressing. But I think it is important to show you how broken today's workplaces actually are. So we wanted to solve this problem from a personal perspective, because we believe that if you spend 40 hours a week at work, this should also be time that you thoroughly enjoy and where you can contribute to something that you truly believe in. But let's say you're the CEO of an organization and all you care about is the bottom line. So how successful is the organization in what it tries to do? And happy employees is not really your thing. Well, then still it is beneficial to focus on creating a workplace where people love to be. Simply because there's a very strong correlation between motivation on the one hand and business outcomes on the other hand. So once again, some data gathered on the topic, you see that productivity and profit are much higher when people are more engaged at work, while at the same time absenteeism, accidents, and defects are a lot lower when people are more engaged at work. So especially when you work in healthcare doing such important work, it is interesting to figure out a way to reduce the amount of accidents and defects that are being made in the processes that you are working on. So it's interesting for anyone, for people who love to have a more fun workplace, but also for organizations that try to do a better job. So this was the premise of starting Corporate Rebels. And in January 2016, as I already mentioned, we quit our jobs and we made a list of pioneers around the world. So organizations, academics, CEOs, entrepreneurs, all kinds of people and organizations that could teach us how to make work more fun. We called it a bucket list, so a list of pioneers we wanted to visit. We put it up on a website, corporaterebels.com, you can still see that list over there. And we started to visit them one by one to understand how these organizations are actually working different than the traditional organizations that many people are familiar with. And we still do it. We've just come back from a research trip to Japan, where we learned about progressive Japanese businesses who are completely reinventing the way they work in a completely different culture, but focused on a lot of the similar things that we are seeing in other parts of the world. So I want to share with you some of the main lessons that we learned. And I'm going to talk you through them one by one. An important disclaimer, this is not a model you can simply implement in your organizations. These are ideas, insights, and inspiration taken from these pioneers, and it should start a discussion in your organization, but it shouldn't be an idea that you simply copy-paste into your workplace, because we've seen that happening around the world, and it doesn't lead to high levels of success. What is much more important is to have a discussion, figure out what you want to experiment with to improve the way you work, and then find your own journey and adventure towards a better workplace. So, starting with trend number one is a move from profit to purpose and values. So especially, of course, for private businesses, this is an important one. And we see that many of these pioneers move away from the idea that organizations only exist to make money and instead focus on having a more noble purpose and a clear set of values that guide their behavior. So making money, of course, is important for almost all organizations, but this should not be the reason they exist. Instead, the purpose should be leading the reason why that business is there, and they use the profit to make investments and to grow their impact towards their purpose. And these pioneers often compare profit to oxygen for human beings. You need it to stay alive, you need to breathe to stay alive, but as a human being, it's not the reason you exist, or at least hopefully not. And there is something more important in life that you want to achieve, and you need to breathe in order to be able to do that. Second trend is a move from hierarchical pyramids to a network of teams. So we're all familiar with the traditional hierarchical management structure, where you have the CEO on top of that pyramid, then you have lots of management layers in between, and then you get to the frontline staff who are doing most of the operational work. This used to work really well 100, 150 years ago during the Industrial Revolution, when things were pretty much stable and predictable every day you would come into the workplace. But nowadays, when things change so quickly and things are constantly changing, our organizations need to be much more responsive, much more adaptable to those constantly changing needs. And therefore, these pioneers break down the hierarchical structure and form into a network of team structure, where you mostly have 10 to 15 people that are fully responsible for a specific part of the organization. And they take out all these middle management layers and they replace those roles and distribute them towards those teams. And this unleashes a lot of entrepreneurship and initiative within the people, and you have a lot less bureaucracy that is not holding them back so much as we currently see a lot in traditional organizations. Then the third one is a move from directive leadership to supportive leadership. So how can you move away from the idea that there's only bosses who are telling people what to do and how to do it, and instead focus on creating an environment where leaders are supportive to their employees. And we've seen some interesting examples of organizations where teams can select their own manager or their own leader to make sure that they have this supportive leadership in place. Then, from planning and predicting to experimenting and adapting. So, once again, moving away from the idea that you can plan and predict the future, and instead focus on constantly testing new approaches to how you work, but also your services and your products, to figure out what is the best way to approach something at a specific moment in time. And move away from the idea that you have to focus on optimizing for efficiencies every single day. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, as the world is very complex and things are changing very quickly. A beautiful example is Handelsbanken. You might be familiar with it. It's a large Swedish bank. They employ 14,000 people, and it's a large financial institution. But they say we don't want to predict what will happen in the future. We just want to be able to respond properly to changes that are coming our way. And for example, they don't have an annual budgeting cycle in place in this financial institution with 14,000 people. And instead, they focus on constantly adapting themselves based on what they learn. And you see that in times of crisis, for example, during the pandemic, they are outperforming their traditional competitors because they are much more responsive than the others. Then, the fifth trend is from rules and control to freedom and trust. So, how can you move away from all those rules and policies and bureaucracy that dictates how people should be doing their job? And how can you instead focus on creating a workplace where people have freedom, autonomy, and the right level of trust to be able to make their own decisions? And it makes a lot of sense to do this, because at home, in our private lives, we have a huge amount of freedom and we have a huge amount of responsibility. And we, for example, we raise our kids, we arrange a mortgage, buy a house, organize things with our friends and our communities. These are huge responsibilities, but then when we come into the workplace, we're in most cases not even allowed to spend 500 or 1,000 euros of company money. And there's all these approvals you have to go through before you can actually spend it. That doesn't make sense. So that's why these pioneers focus on reducing the bureaucracy and the rules and the policies, and instead give their people freedom to make their own decisions and use the creativity that they have also in the workplace. Then, the sixth trend is a move from centralized authority to distributed authority. So pushing decision-making as far to the front line as possible, so that people who are in close contact with patients, in your case, are the ones who can make decisions themselves, instead of having to go up the hierarchy for managers or senior leaders to make decisions for them. Then, a move from secrecy to radical transparency. So opening up all kinds of information so that teams can make their own decisions quickly. So they have real-time data available for them to make those decisions, and not having information only available in certain parts, mostly in the top of an organization. Some companies go really far, and they open up the entire company financials for everyone to see, the performance of individuals and teams for everyone in the organization to see, and sometimes even the salary levels. So people are aware of what others in the organization are earning, all to make sure that people can act as entrepreneurs in the organization. And then the final one, the 8th trend, and please indeed make pictures, send it out into the world because more people need to know about this, is a move from job descriptions and fancy job titles to a move towards talents and mastery. So instead of focusing on creating fixed job descriptions and then trying to hire somebody that perfectly fits that job description, to then go and promote people from one job description to the other, instead focus on the specific talents of individuals and create the opportunity for people to customize their own job by picking up various roles and combining that into their ideal job, and then giving them the opportunity to constantly develop those. And we did a big research study in the Netherlands to figure out how present these trends are, and I can tell you this 8th one was lacking most. 67% of the respondents said that they could not use their main talents in their day-to-day work. 67% of people couldn't do that. So we hire people, and we pay them well, and then we don't even give them the opportunity to do the thing they are best at. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's why these pioneers focus instead on creating a workplace where people can actually use and develop their talents as much as possible. So, as I mentioned, 8 trends. So, in generally, these are the lessons we learned from these pioneering organizations. We have visited more than 150 of them, and we still continue to research many of them, both on a practical level, but also on a more academic level, working together with, for example, Harvard Business School and INSEAD Business School and universities, to bring these ideas also into schools, to make sure that more people learn that we can actually organize work in a completely different way than what many people are used to today. So, quick question to you to discuss these 8 trends. I would like you to talk with your neighbor for 1 minute to discuss the trend that is lacking most in your current organization and the one where you feel you're already doing quite a good job at. So 1 minute to discuss that with your neighbor. Go. All right, thank you. Very quick test now to figure out how progressive businesses here in Catalonia actually are. So, it's going to be a very easy test. If you feel that the organization you work in, you're still more on the left-hand side of the spectrum, then you can remain seated. If you feel you're very much on the progressive side already, or on average more on the progressive side, stand up. Please go ahead and stand up if you feel you're more on the progressive side. Otherwise, remain seated. Okay, thank you. Take a look around. There's a lot to be learned and to be done still. And I can tell you this is not very unique for Catalonia. This is wherever we go in the world, there's a lot to be done still. Okay, so let me now start to share with a couple of examples of things we've seen across the world of organizations putting these ideas into practice. You might be familiar already with the story of buurtzorg. You probably pronounce this completely different, but this is the Dutch pronunciation. Probably would be more buurtzorg in your case. It's a home care nursing organization employing 15,000 people. There's not a single manager in the entire organization. And you have teams, more than 1,000 self-managing teams of 10 to 12 nurses who take care of their own neighborhood in the Netherlands and do everything that needs to happen within that neighborhood. So they hire people, they train them, they fire them if needed, they plan their work, they execute their work, and there's no other departments that are telling them how they should be doing their job. So a lot of autonomy, a lot of freedom, and a lot of trust, but also a lot of responsibility at those teams of nurses. And they significantly outperform their traditional competitors in the Netherlands. But there are many more examples, not just in healthcare, but also in manufacturing. We visited a Chinese manufacturing company called Haier. They employ 80,000 people and split up that big organization into a network of more than 4,000, what they call micro-enterprises. So small companies where the employees themselves can decide how much they earn, who they select to be their leader, which opportunities to pursue, how they should be hiring and training people. So there's a lot of decision-making power, once again, within these micro-enterprises. So completely different types of organizations that are applying these ideas in different ways, so there's no one model, but the underlying principles are very much the same. These organizations believe that people are intrinsically good, and we should also treat them like that. We should give them the freedom, the opportunities, and the trust to do their work according to their own ideas and insights. And we shouldn't treat them like small children and tell them what to do every step of the way. When talking about these kinds of organizations, often there's talk about self-management, self-managing companies, self-managing teams, or flat organizations. And we see many of these types of organizations where, as I mentioned, they reduce the layers of hierarchy to provide people with more freedom and autonomy. But there's a lot of misconceptions around flat organizations or self-managing companies, and I want to address a couple of them to help you understand them a little bit better. So the first misconception, self-management equals no structure. This is as wrong as it could be. We often think that if we get rid of the traditional bureaucratic structures with the hierarchical layers, that we just have a lot of freedom for people without any structure. I can tell you there's a lot of companies who have tried it and they all end up in chaos. But there are a lot of self-managing organizations that succeed, and they actually focus on creating structures, a lot of structures, maybe even more than traditional organizations. But the structures are not telling people how they should be doing their job, but they provide a sort of framework where people can work within, to provide clarity for people to understand what they are working on and how things are done within specific organizations. So that's the first one. The second one, people can do whatever they want. It might sound like this when people have a lot of freedom and autonomy, but it doesn't really work like that in practice. Because people come and join a certain organization because they want to contribute to it. They're not just there to do whatever the hell they want. They are there to actually work with their colleagues to contribute to something they truly believe in. So it is very clear who's working on what. For example, the self-managing teams in buurtzorg and in other organizations have a very clear understanding what it is that each person of the team is responsible for. And besides having a huge amount of freedom and autonomy, they also have a huge amount of responsibility because they are the only ones responsible for the success of their teams and the patients they treat. Then third one, in flat companies, there is no leadership and no hierarchy. This is another big misconception. So it is indeed true that there's no artificial type of hierarchy where you would just tell people if they have a manager role, they also have authority. But in these organizations, you have a natural type of leadership, a natural type of hierarchy to arise. Because in any team of people, there's always some that are taking more of the lead and responsibility and initiative than others, who might prefer to follow along people who are more eager to take the lead. And this natural type of leadership, this natural type of hierarchy, is possible to arise in these kinds of organizations, where you don't tell a specific person who will be the manager and who will be making the decisions, but you leave it up to the natural dynamics to arise. For example, I always love this comparison. If you would like to organize something with your friends, for example, you want to go away on a vacation together, you don't appoint a manager who will make all the decisions for your group of friends, but instead you focus on people taking initiative themselves, all contributing to something to make this vacation come to life. And it is actually that simple. You have to provide people the opportunity to do what they do at home, also in the workplace. So, we got a couple of misconceptions out of the way. Now let's dive into more detail in an example of an organization putting these trends very powerfully into practice. And it might be an organization where you wouldn't really expect a thing like this to happen, namely a big government organization in Belgium. The FOD FOD Social Security is more or less the Ministry of Social Security in Brussels, Belgium. So they support all the social security topics in the country. Back when they started the transformation, they employed 2,000 people, so a big organization that at that time, when Frank van Massenhoven, the man you see here, became the leader of that organization, they were very bureaucratic. They were very much organized in this top-down control manner where they would simply tell people how they should be doing their job. They had a huge amount of rules and policies that dictated how people should be doing their work. And as a result, a lot of people were frustrated. A lot were calling in sick. They had a lot of problem with people walking away to other organizations. The people that were still there were frustrated. They were complaining a lot. And they couldn't really contribute to what the organization was trying to do because bureaucracy was getting in their way. And Frank van Massenhoven felt that they needed to change the organization to provide better services to the citizens of Belgium. And he said, we're going to start doing that by having regular conversations with people here in the organization to understand where their biggest frustrations are. To have a dialogue with these people to learn what can we do better to make your work more fun. How can we actually create a workplace where people love to be so the services that we provide will be better than what we're currently doing. And they started to set up loads of different experiments. For example, when it comes to flexibility at work, this was in 2002, so long before the pandemic, and they already started focusing on working from home. So back in 2002, this was still quite new, and they said, well, we want to give you more freedom, but we have to learn this. So they started some experiments. At first, they started to work with result-based working. They said, if we're not going to focus anymore on the amount of time you spend behind your computer in the office, we're going to focus on the results that are part of the work that you do. Because in the end, we don't hire you to spend an amount of hours behind your computer. We hire you to contribute to what we're trying to do here, to deliver valuable work to our organization. So we have to find a way to assess that. So that was the first experiment they set up. And they, still within the regular 9 to 5, learned how to work based on result. And then they said, okay, now we get this, let's get away with some of our rules. And they first got rid of the idea that people had to come to the office from 9 to 5. They said, you still have to come to the office, but we can be more flexible. So you can come in whenever you want, as long as you spend 8 hours in the office. This was a very successful experiment. Engagement went up and productivity went up. They then moved it into the next phase and said, well, we're going to give you more freedom. Now you can also decide where you work. So you can also work from home or in a cafe, as long as you make 8 hours a day and still deliver valuable work. This, once again, was a successful experiment, so they pushed it even further. And then they said, well, now you can work from wherever you want, whenever you want, and even how many hours a week you want. We're not going to track at all how many hours you work. We just want you to deliver the right outcomes for our organization. So, this was very successful, the entire experiment, so they started to scale this within the organization, and nowadays these civil servants actually have the opportunity to decide for themselves when they work, where they work, how they work, and even with which people in the organization they prefer to collaborate. So a lot of freedom, a lot of trust in this organization, and also a lot better business outcomes since they've started making these big changes. But they also recently, in the past 5 years, have been making big changes in their organizational setup. And a big part of the organization nowadays is organized into a self-managing way, where there are no managers anymore, but the teams themselves are very much responsible for the work they deliver. And this went, of course, through a big transformation process. It doesn't happen overnight. And they took about 1 year to prepare, to design all the changes they wanted to make, to set up this new organizational structure, to decide who will be the best person to fit in which team, and which kind of skills do we need in the teams to be successful. But also, how are we going to measure which team is successful and which team is not, so these teams can actually self-organize and solve their own issues. And then, after a time of preparation, they moved 300 people of this larger organization into this self-managing structure. Of course, with some challenges at the beginning, but over time, these teams learned for themselves how to work better. Not so much anymore listening to the rules or the managers and how they told them to do their job, but much more focusing on their own ideas, their own creativity, to figure out how to be successful as a team. And these changes led to a lot of impressive results inside this Belgian ministry. For example, in the first 10 years of their transformation, their productivity increased every single year with more than 10%. Remind you with giving people this more freedom and autonomy that I talked about. Nowadays, they have the lowest absenteeism of any organization in Belgium, while before the transformation, they experienced a lot of problems with this. Before the transformation, when they put out a job vacancy and they wanted to hire a new person, on average, 3 people replied to their vacancies. Nowadays, after the transformation, 57 people reply to these vacancies. So they are much better able to attract new talent to their organization simply because people know what kind of a workplace it is. Then, before the transformation, 18% of the students who had to pick one of the ministries to work for wanted to work for them. Nowadays, 92% prefer to work for this specific ministry. So, attracting young talent has become much easier for them because people are aware of how they work. And another interesting one, they won the Gender Balanced Organization Award because they have on all levels in the organization great gender balance. But they did not put one single gender policy in place. They simply provided people the opportunity to design their own work life around their private life and combine everything they wanted to do outside of work with their work itself. Not telling people when to work, where to work, and how to do their work, but instead giving them the opportunity to deliver results whenever they felt most capable of doing so. So, some interesting lessons can be learned from this Belgian ministry, and the ideas and the principles and the philosophies, but also the transformation strategies are very similar to what we see in other organizations in different sectors all across the world. So, the big question then is, how do you get there? So, there's a lot of inspiring organizations out there that you can learn from, but there are of course also a couple of things to take into account when you want to transform into a more progressive way of working. So, let's share some ideas, some things that we've learned from these 150 plus visits to make you understand better what are the things we can and cannot do when thinking about moving into a more progressive way of working. So, first of all, I think it's important to understand that there are different approaches. There's not one single approach that is the silver bullet to make an engaging and happy organization. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. But there are some options. So, for example, you can start focusing on teams first, where you don't want to change the entire organizational structure. You feel that's too risky or something you simply cannot do. You don't, for example, have the power to do that. But you still want to focus on starting small. So you can invite a couple of teams in the organization to try some of these ideas and to put some of this stuff into practice. Then, a bit more risky, but still kind of a contained level of risk, is upgrading all of the teams in an organization at once, training them and helping them to become more progressive, and then allowing them to experiment themselves to figure out the best way to work. Then, if you're a bit more risky, or a bit more radical, there's the option of taking a part of the organization, for example, a business unit or a more autonomous department that you can quite easily separate from the rest of the business, and then give them the opportunity to completely redefine their way of working, including their organizational structure, as for example, the example I shared before, the Belgian ministry, where they had just 300 people of that larger organization participate in the self-management experiment to figure out how does it actually work for us. Let's find a way to make it work, and then see if we can transfer the rest of the organization into this new model as well. And then, for the true rebels out there, the option to go all in with a big bang into this new organizational structure at once. This is not something we would advise many organizations to do, and this mostly is interesting for companies that are in big trouble and that need to radically do things differently to be able, for example, to sustain themselves or to stay alive, and that feel that they can actually go down a riskier path to make sure that they can actually survive as an organization. So there's different options which might speak to different people here in the audience. Probably most of you either don't have the power, the knowledge, or the passion, or the risk appetite to go for any of the top ones. So I want to focus now on what you can do on team level to make a more progressive way of working inside your organization. And there's a couple of general lessons that we learned from these organizations. So I mentioned that there's quite a bit of structure in these self-managing teams and these self-managing organizations. I want to share a couple of structures that they put in place to make sure that they can actually work very much based on freedom and trust. So the first one is to work with roles and responsibilities. That means that as a team, you split up the work that you do into roles, and people can pick up the roles they like to pick up. This is different than the job description that I described before. So as a team, what can you do to make this come to life? Is you make a list of all of the things you need to do as a team to be successful. For example, just write it down on post-its, post it on the walls, to make sure you can capture everything that your team needs to do to be successful. Then cluster these different activities into roles. So pick the activities that are more or less similar or that belong to a specific type of work, and put them together into a role. Then give people in the team the option to self-select which roles they would like to pick up. And make sure that people pick up more than one role. So you actually distribute the roles as much as possible. And then, if nobody wants to pick up specific roles in the team, there's two things you can do. So the first option is simply do nothing. Don't pick up that role. And in many cases, you will actually learn that those roles that nobody wants to pick up, you don't really have to do them. If you run into trouble, you can still solve them as you actually encounter that problem. And then maybe outsource that role to somebody else. Or if you're hiring a new person later on, you might look for somebody who actually loves to pick up that specific role. And doing this allows people to pick up the thing they love to do, focus on their talents, focus on their motivation, but also experience a lot of autonomy and have a lot of decision-making power in the thing they like to do most. Because working with these roles, you also distribute the decision-making power to the people who pick up those specific roles. So, distributing the work into roles and giving them lots of responsibility and also a lot of authority in those roles. Another thing that we see in all of these teams in how they do things, they distribute decision-making power. So, when people pick up these various roles, give full decision-making power to the people in those roles. You don't need a manager anymore to make decisions for the team. You don't want one single person to be making all the decisions, but you want people with expertise and the ones who are most committed to a specific role to make decisions themselves. And many of these organizations then use the so-called advice process, where you simply ask a couple of people for advice, and then you make a decision yourself. But you don't need to seek for consensus, because this can be quite tedious and can take quite a long time, and takes away some of the entrepreneurship and initiative. But instead you focus on, for example, this advice process, where you try to find a way for people to pick up specific topics, take a lot of initiative, ask some advice from people, and then go ahead and make a decision. Then the third one, running better meetings. And this speaks, I think, to quite a lot of people in the room here as well, as it does all around the world. Because the meetings in our organizations are one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest frustrations that many people experience. We have too many of them. They are not really productive. We just talk a lot and we don't have really tangible outcomes at the end of a meeting. We invite way too many people to them, and we simply kind of waste our time in these meetings. So many of these companies, these pioneers, first of all get rid of most of the meetings that they have inside their organization. And they find another way to make decisions or communicate with each other. Could be online, could be still in person, but finding another way to get work done without always being into meetings with each other. Because we all know most of the actual work we do doesn't really happen in meetings, but mostly outside of the meetings when we can be most productive. And then besides getting rid of most of your meetings, many of these also focus on alternative meeting structures, where you don't just sit in a room, go through an agenda and all talk over each other, and mostly listening to the most extroverted people in the room. Instead, they have pretty fixed meeting formats, where people talk in turns, so one by one, and you have a predetermined way of going through an agenda where people can bring in their own topics and take full responsibility for their specific topics. So, ditching most of your meetings and redefining and restructuring the ones that you still keep. Then, another important one, giving better feedback. In many organizations, in many teams, this is a big challenge. We don't really dare to say to one another if we feel the other person is not performing well, if they are doing things that are harming the team or the patients that you are supporting. So learning to give better feedback to one another is a vital ingredient for these self-managing teams. And it doesn't have to be complex. You don't have to go through many feedback trainings to get this done. For example, some pioneering organizations use a very simple tactic, and every month or 2 months, they bring the team together and they ask everyone in the team to come up with the stop, start, and continue for the other colleagues in the team. So what should I stop doing as a team member? What should I start doing? And what should I continue doing? So a very simple approach, have a dialogue around these 3 aspects and start improving as a team. Might be very uncomfortable in the beginning, but the more you practice it, the more normal and the more valuable it will start to feel. And then the 5th one, set up a conflict resolution process. So you don't have a manager anymore to interfere in the conflicts that arise in a team, but instead you want the team itself to be able to solve the conflicts that they come across. So have a very simple process in place that helps these teams to solve their own conflicts, instead of having a situation where you have a manager who's sort of interfering as a referee in that team. So, some ideas about what these progressive teams do inside these progressive organizations to make their workplace more engaging, more motivating, and more productive. And this is not rocket science. This is something that can be done in any type of organization, even if it's very traditional still. You, with your team members, can start experimenting with some of these ideas. And interestingly, we come across organizations where change doesn't have to come from the very top. Sometimes change starts in one team in a larger organization, where, for example, in the Netherlands, we have an example called bol.com. It's an e-commerce company, and a 20-person logistics team started to experiment with new ways of working. They started to experiment with many of these 5 things to understand how can we make our work better. Then, after a period of 4 or 5 months, they saw very good outcomes of the experiments that they set up. And they then said, well, if we've been making such good progress, we should start supporting other teams in the organization to start doing the same thing. So then, more teams jumped along, and this first team simply said to others, if you want to learn this too, if you also want to benefit from more motivation and more productivity, give us a call and we will help you, we will coach you to start doing the same thing. And after a period of 3 years, 70% of the organization that employed back then 2,000 people started working like this. So it started with 20 people, but because of their success, other teams started to operate like this too. And nowadays, 70-75% of the organization works like this. And because of the impact they had, they could also start changing bigger things, like organizational structure, like other HR policies that they wanted to change, because also the organization realized the potential of moving into a more progressive way of working. So, lots of examples of companies, many more to be discussed, but I want to go back briefly to the story of Corporate Rebels itself. I didn't mention the most embarrassing part of the start. Because I told you back in January 2016, we quit our jobs, and we didn't have any business model back then. So we had no idea how we were going to make money. We had a little bit of savings in the bank. I had some air miles left from my previous job. And we said, well, we want to visit these pioneers. We believe that we can last with the money that we have, maybe 9 to 12 months. And we didn't really do a thorough calculation because most of it happened during that conversation at the beer garden in Barcelona. So you can imagine it wasn't the most thorough accounting report. But we thought we could last 9 to 12 months. We learned that that was not really the case. After a period of 3 months, we learned that the travel was quite a bit more expensive than what we thought. So then we had to change things. But already in the beginning, when we didn't know how much money we actually having, we moved into one apartment. But it got even worse. We moved into one bedroom. So you had 2 beds in this one bedroom where the host and myself were sleeping to save costs so we can actually fund the travels that we wanted to make. So that started in 2016 like that. Luckily, in the very first year, the story and the blogs that we were writing about the companies that we were visiting got picked up. So the story was shared in The Guardian, the BBC, in the New York Times, in some Dutch newspapers, because apparently many more people were interested to learn from these progressive companies how work could actually be made more fun. So that was back in 2016. We started to gain some momentum with more people around the world reading our blog posts and being interested in this topic. So we started to organize all kinds of meetups and events to bring these people together, to share their own stories, their own insights, to help each other to reinvent the way they worked. In 2018, we started doing academic research, as I mentioned before, to also make sure that people who are currently in school are learning about alternative ways of working. Because if we want to make a big change in how companies work, we need to start in schools so people are actually prepared before they go into their workplaces, that things can be done differently than the traditional management approach. Then, 2019, we published a book, Corporate Rebels, translated into 8, now 9 languages. The Chinese one came out a couple of weeks ago. There's also a Spanish version if you're interested. It's called Revolucionarios del Trabajo. And it talks about many of these companies and how they put these ideas into practice. Then the pandemic hit. And this was an interesting turning point, because before the pandemic, when we would be having sessions like this, and for example, we would talk about working from home or remote work, many would call us crazy. And they said, well, it's great that it works over there, these pioneering companies, but it will never work in our organization. And then there were all kinds of excuses that people were coming up with. We're too small, we're too large, we're in the wrong region in the world, it doesn't work here. Our people are too highly educated, or our people are too lowly educated. All kinds of reasons why this wouldn't work for people. But then, when people went into lockdown, they learned that it was actually possible to allow people to work from home and still be productive. And a lot of people actually like to have a better balance between working in the office and working from home. So it opened up an entire conversation around new ways of working. It started maybe with remote work, but it's now moving into all kinds of areas. So if we can give people more flexibility in where they work, can we also try some of the other ideas that these pioneers have been testing already for decades? Then in 2021, we launched an online academy, which is a learning platform for people to learn through courses from these pioneering organizations. Plus, there's a whole community of like-minded people that want to achieve the same thing. They all want to create better workplaces. And then our most ambitious effort so far is called a new company called Chrysos. It's partly based here in Spain, with 3 of the partners being from different parts of Spain. And with Chrysos, it's a private equity company, so we buy and transform small and medium-sized businesses from the traditional way of working to the more progressive way of working, to show that it's not just more fun, but also better for business. And then once the transformations are completed, we sell the company to the employees, so it becomes a cooperative or an employee-owned business where people actually have the decision-making power to control their own destiny, and that it doesn't go back to this traditional model that many are still a big fan of. So, everything we do is always still focused on making work more fun. And we're trying to build a movement around the world to show that work can be organized differently and to support organizations across the globe to reinvent the way they work. And we need you to become a part of this too. We actually need you to become a rebel inside your organization too. Because we need to do something about those terrible statistics that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. With so many people being disengaged and unhappy at work or even burned out or feeling that their job makes no valuable contribution to society, we need to change things. So the more people become a rebel inside their organization and start experimenting with new ways of working, the more we can improve those terrible statistics and the more successful and engaging workplaces we can create. So, final invitation, become a rebel inside your organization. You have our permission, so if everybody starts complaining, just blame us. And start reinventing the way they work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pim. We have a question from the audience. What kind of tools do you give the teams to self-organize, if any?
So in terms of tools, so I mentioned a couple of the things that these teams usually get in order to succeed as a self-managing team. So decision making, running meetings in a different way, distributing work into roles and responsibilities. Those are vitally important. In terms of like technical tools, I'm not sure if that's the question, but it often is. Technicals, that it doesn't really matter that much. So I think we overemphasize the dependency on specific tools. It is, of course, important to be transparent around who's working on what, how the team is performing. So that needs to be in place somehow, but there's no specific tools that are required to do that.
Transparency and trust.
Exactly.
Okay. When I see your chart, when you represent 10 topics that move from bureaucracy to progressive, maybe one of them, the number 5, that talk about the loss of control. Maybe in our bureaucratic organizations is the topic that could get more fear to the chief executive officers. Yep. The loss of control.
Yeah, I totally agree, and we see this in many organizations that the fear of giving up control or losing control is quite big. But mostly, I think it's important to understand that it's not really control that we currently have. It's more the illusion of control in many organizations. So we think that we can actually control people, but that's of course an impossible thing to do. And I think it's always important to show kind of the downside of these control mechanisms. So one powerful example from my previous job, I was traveling for a company that makes baggage handling systems for airports. So traveling a lot around the world to all kinds of airports. And then I came back and I had to fill in my expense claims. So a long Excel sheet to make sure that all the money I spent was according to the company rules and guidelines. Then this Excel sheet was sent to my manager for approval. He had to sign off. And then it was sent to his manager for approval. They also had to sign off. So there were people with like high paid salaries just checking all the receipts that I was handing in, so kind of wasting their time. And then, believe it or not, they were sent to a separate department that was exclusively set up to check expense claims. So there were people working on a full-time basis to go through all of these receipts and make sure everything was according to the rules. And for example, a progressive company like Netflix, they just have one guideline in their travel policy, and that's act in Netflix's best interest. So use the money as if it was your own money. If you have to go to a fancy restaurant to get an important deal with a client, then please go ahead and do that. But if you think you can achieve the same thing and spend less money, then please do that. We trust you to be a responsible adult and to make those decisions perfectly yourself. And then you don't need all of this control mechanism in place, which is very costly, but also getting in the way of people using their own common sense.
And inefficient.
Highly inefficient, yeah.
Yeah. Well, 5 years ago, we learned from Buurtzorg when we invited Jos de Blok just here to share with us their experience. This model is very inspiring for us. It's a model of progressive project with excellent outcomes, but I heard from your blog. Some colleagues of you wrote that when Buurtzorg tried to move to United Kingdom with a system very similar to ours, difficulties appeared because they moved the idea, but maybe this is not enough.
Yeah, so there's one, I think, important mistake that a lot of companies make when they want to transform like this. And they, so first of all, it is very challenging. That is very clear. Like changing from this bureaucratic organization into a more progressive one is not easy. But many look at one example. So for example, in healthcare, there are not that many examples of progressive organizations. And Buurtzorg is such a good and shiny example that a lot of people see that as sort of the holy grail. So they take the idea of Buurtzorg and then try to do exactly the same thing inside their organization, which is not a very smart thing to do because it takes a lot more time to think things out, to experiment with a lot of things, to try a lot of things, to make a lot of mistakes and then evolve as you go. So I think this is also some of the things that they're learning in the UK at the moment. So some experiments are really successful, but sometimes they're also running into all kinds of trouble. For example, that they are in one bigger organization, they take a small part of it and make it sort of Buurtzorg organized. But in the team it works really nicely and they have really good success. But then when they interact with the more traditional organization, this might lead to a lot of trouble. So they're still, like you have this bureaucratic part and the more progressive part, and it doesn't really match well together. So that's also why the advice of Jos de Blok and many others is to separate a part of the organization and really put it outside of the existing organization to make sure it can live a life on its own and that it's not restrained by the bureaucracy that's still in place.
Okay. I know. Well, a last question. Some recommendation, last recommendation to managers that are suffering from bureaucracy and a lot of control, just inspiring for the next year?
Yeah, so I think it's not, in many, what we notice in many of our talks, we talk about self-management, so we talk about the fact that there are no middle managers anymore. That is not a reason for people to become scared if they are in a middle manager position. And I'll tell you why. So for many of the people working in these traditional companies that then transform into a more progressive, more self-managing way of working, there's often very much a barrier with middle management because they don't want to change as well, because they feel they will lose their job. But that's not the case, actually. So we still need a lot of people in these organizations. We just don't need the position of middle manager anymore. So I think you should distinguish, on the one hand, the position, and on the other hand, the person. You still need the person, but you don't need that specific position anymore because you distribute the role of a middle manager among the various teams. So, and actually a lot of the middle managers in these organizations say, well, we feel much more free, much more liberated, and now we can actually support the teams much better, be it more as a coach or be it more as a team member, to support the team towards success. And we are stuck in the middle anymore between top management and these teams, which a lot of middle managers also find very frustrating. And they actually enjoy their work a lot more in this new type of organization because of the freedom and the autonomy that also they experience very much. So for me, yeah, like I think an important recommendation would be for any manager of any team is to start applying some of these ideas yourself. And you don't need to convince the entire organization to follow along, but just set up some experiments in your team to understand how you can work better. And you will feel that a lot of the responsibility and a lot of the pressure will be moved from your position to the rest of the team, who will much better be able to cope with that than just one individual person. And so for a lot of managers, I think the main recommendation would be to start a discussion with your team around these topics, figure out where currently is the biggest frustration, and then start setting up some experiments to make it better. Maybe change your meetings first or change your decision-making first. And then once the first experiment is successful, then start building from there. And you'll notice that work is not just more fun for the team, but also for the management position yourself.
Okay. If there's any other question, thank you very much, Pim, for your lecture. It has been very helpful for us.
Thank you very much.